December 2023. A Chinese delegation arrives in Riyadh. The event passes in silence. No gunfire, no oil crisis, no breaking headlines. The media dismisses it as a routine diplomatic stop, buried under a mountain of daily noise. But that silence is what makes it terrifying. If a US strategist from 1995 looked into that room, they would see something unthinkable, a world functioning perfectly, without revolving around Washington. As debates over America's waning influence ignite, the same old question arises: who will replace them? That is a trap. Look at the macroeconomic balance sheet. America still sits at the pinnacle, while the rest of the world looks up. The dollar dictates reserves. The defense budget dwarfs the next 10 nations combined. The world's greatest tech empires are all anchored in US soil. But here is the twist. What if the question, who replaces America, was dead on arrival? Perhaps the world doesn't need a single understudy. It is simply learning how to live in a room where many lights shine at once. To understand these roots, we must go back to when the idea of a multipolar world was dismissed as science fiction. 1991. The Soviet Union collapses. History books record this as the final chapter of the Cold War. But for those witnessing it, it wasn't a victory, it was a sudden vacuum. For half a century, the world was defined by two parallel axes, Washington and Moscow. Then, one cracked from within. It didn't take a battlefield showdown. As the dust of the 20th century settled, America stood alone. Analysts dubbed it the unipolar moment. Put yourself in the shoes of a 1995 strategist. Instinct pointed to a single coordinate: the United States. America rose, like a colossal monolith, draining resources and talent. New York coordinated global capital flow. Silicon Valley programmed how humanity connects. Hollywood exported the dreams. In 1997, a young engineer named Satya Nadella arrived on US soil with big ambitions. He is the man who would eventually sit in the CEO chair at Microsoft. Nadella was no exception. It was a voluntary exodus of the world's brightest minds. When I dissected this unipolar order, I expected dossiers on aircraft carriers or nuclear warheads. But the deeper I dug, the supreme power led back to boring gray boardrooms, encryption protocols, shipping lanes, and semiconductor standards, and the international financial institutions. A businessman in Jakarta, a bank in Brazil, or a logistics firm in Vietnam might know nothing of US politics. But the moment they step into the global ocean, they are forced to speak the same language, play by the same rules, and use the same currency. That is in power that is invisible, but absolute. It hides in daily habits. Like the paint color in the room you've lived in since childhood, you mistake it for reality. You only panic when someone brings a blade to scrape it away. Many economists argue the world voluntarily chose the dollar because the US market is deep and its assets are safe. They call this the network effect. Like a QWERTY keyboard on your laptop, you continue to use it not because it's the most efficient, but because everyone else is using it. The cost to dismantle it and learn a new system is simply too high. For 3 decades, this order functioned like a giant money printing machine. Trade exploded. Logistics costs bottomed out. Hundreds of millions in East Asia climbed out of poverty on the back of globalization. But just as the unipolar dynasty hit its peak, the coldest heads in Washington began to sweat. Washington played a high-stakes, arrogant game based on 3 subjective assumptions. Russia was sidelined permanently, China was content being a low-cost factory, and the disgruntled nations were too divided to ever sit at the same table. History, however, has a cruel law. The very success of a system nourishes the forces that will eventually dismantle it. While the crowd was intoxicated by victory, Zbigniew Brzezinski saw the first cracks. He looked at the geopolitical map and posed a challenge to all the optimism. If one day, the nations aren't strong enough to face America alone, but decide to set aside their hatreds to shake hands behind our backs, what then? Today, the coalition in Brzezinski's nightmare is no longer theoretical. Since the late 90s, he understood that America's tower of power wouldn't fall from an external strike, but would crack from the naive assumptions buried deep within the system itself. The British in the early 20th century looked at a map splashed with colonial red and believed the sun would never set. Those on the mountaintop rarely see the sunset coming, because history always shifts from the tiny cracks beneath the foundation. And the first crack of the unipolar era has rung out, not in New York, but in the dust of Iraq. An empire doesn't crumble from grand proclamations. It begins quietly in a sealed room in Washington, through a discarded report or a reckless decision made when the Americans truly believed they were immune to failure. In 2003, Abrams tanks rolled into Baghdad. The White House aimed to prove an ultimate doctrine: American power could crush and reconstruct a nation in mere weeks. On paper, the plan was as simple as building IKEA furniture. Until step 7, when you realize you have 3 spare screws and no idea where they go. The military campaign ended in a flash. Saddam's statue fell under the glare of global cameras. But the following months dragged America into a labyrinth of insurgency, ethnic violence, and guerrilla quagmires. The classified cables sent back to the Pentagon were forced to use a phrase filled with unease: unexpected complexity. For the first time since the Cold War, the world witnessed a raw truth. The U.S. could defeat any army on the battlefield, but military victory no longer guaranteed control over the final outcome. That stumble lasted 2 decades, leading straight to the summer of 2021 in Afghanistan. The images of a C-17 taking off in panic from Kabul airport, desperate people clinging to the fuselage only to fall into the void. That was the moment the superpower mask fell off. Trillions of dollars vaporized. What kept the analysts in Washington up at night wasn't the withdrawal itself. It was the agonizing question: why did a system fueled by blood, treasure, and 20 years of effort collapse like a sandcastle in 24 hours? In the Middle East, the world began to see gaps to maneuver. The most terrifying shift wasn't on the battlefield, but within the plumbing of global finance. Cutting Russia off from SWIFT was initially branded by the West as a fatal blow, but it triggered a dangerous, unintended reaction. When nations saw that a major country could be wiped off the financial map with the flick of a switch, others smelled the risk. In international finance, when you see your neighbor struck by lightning, you don't stop to debate the weather. You go buy a lightning rod. And that is exactly what many nations did. Beijing expanded its CIPS network. Moscow fired up SPFS. The first barrels of oil began to be priced in yuan. The global system didn't collapse, but more and more countries decided they no longer wanted to hand the only key to the safe over to Washington. An energy contract signed in local currency, a shipping agency switching insurers, a bank quietly installing a parallel payment system. History rarely changes with a massive explosion. It changes through millions of tiny, unnoticed decisions. Saudi Arabia is the ultimate proof. The relationship between Riyadh and Washington was once a constant, like gravity. But nations don't think like television audiences. They think like risk managers. As the geopolitical axis shifted, Riyadh immediately diversified its basket of eggs. Chinese delegations were welcomed. Riyadh didn't turn its back on America. They simply did what every wise nation does. Prepare multiple exits rather than holding on to just one key to the house. Iraq exposed the limits of military power. Afghanistan shattered the belief in nation-building. SWIFT turned network dependency into a life-or-death risk. And Saudi Arabia reflects the trend of expanding strategic options to ensure survival. In the 90s, the question was, how will the world adapt to American power? Today, the question is inverted. How will America react to a world that is learning how to live without them? Just as that question becomes urgent, a crisis erupts right on Wall Street, the beating heart of the Western system. Beneath the surface of stability, one of the greatest bubbles in modern history is beginning to fracture. When it bursts, the world's faith in American leadership will suffer a fatal blow. September 15, 2008. If you ask the world what truly threatened the global order, no one would have pointed to an investment bank. No missiles. No wars. Just a brief, cold headline in the financial news. Lehman Brothers has collapsed. At first glance, it was just another mundane business failure. A company falling from grace. But history's greatest crises always start exactly like this. They hide behind the things the masses are convinced could never trigger a catastrophe. Years prior, the US seemed to have discovered the magic formula. Home prices rising, banks lending, investors reaping profits. The more players entered the game, the faster the machine roared. While everyone was busy lining their pockets, nobody wanted to ask the uncomfortable questions. A former bank executive put it bluntly, "As long as the music is playing, you have to get up and dance." Everyone knew the party would eventually end, but nobody knew when, and certainly, nobody wanted to be the first one to walk out the door. For a long time, risk was packaged, rebranded, and sold as an absolutely safe asset. On paper, the system looked genius. In reality, it was a skyscraper built on a foundation that nobody ever bothered to inspect. When the bubble burst, the consequences spread faster than any forecast could predict. The crisis didn't just stay on the ticker screens. It ignited the moment ordinary people stepped out of their homes and realized their lives had been upended. A family lost the home they'd lived in for years. A worker lost his job because the company ran dry on credit. A shopkeeper was forced to shut their doors because the customers vanished. They didn't design these complex financial products. They didn't trade billions of dollars. And they never sat in those Manhattan boardrooms. Yet they were the ones who paid the price. 2008 sowed seeds of profound insecurity in millions. Not just because they were poorer, but because they realized the system they once trusted was remarkably fragile. And a quiet, haunting question emerged. If the very core of the global system could commit such a fatal error, was placing all our faith in a single center truly wise? This wasn't anti-American sentiment. Even Washington's closest allies began to wonder the same thing. Globalization created a paradox. When the center functions well, everyone thrives. But when it malfunctions, the shockwave electrocutes the entire network. The terrifying part wasn't that the crisis happened. The terrifying part was that so many nations realized they had absolutely no contingency plan. While the media's eyes were glued to the wreckage in the West, a different story was unfolding across the Pacific. China wasn't immune to the recession. Factories felt the pressure, and exports slowed. But the image the world saw was drastically different. While major economies were busy scrambling to patch their wounds, Beijing was relentlessly pouring capital into railways, seaports, and industrial zones. China wasn't necessarily stronger than the US, but for the first time, nations began to ask, if the future isn't defined by just one center, then what does it look like? Looking back today, the 2008 crisis didn't bring America to its knees. They remain the world's largest economy. Silicon Valley still shapes the globe. The dollar remains dominant. But power isn't measured by muscle alone, it's measured by trust. 2008 carved a hairline fracture in global perception. Throughout the 90s, the masses believed the US-led model was the only game in town. After 2008, nations began to think differently. The question was no longer, how do we replace America? But instead, how do we build options outside of America? If Iraq exposed the limits of military might and Afghanistan shattered the faith in nation building, then 2008 broke a much deeper macro faith, the belief that the core of the global system always knew what it was doing. They quietly began seeking more partners, more trade routes, and alternative payment systems, bracing for a 21st century that wouldn't resemble the 20th. Among them, one nation had been watching all of this very closely. A place once dismissed as a cheap factory floor, where Washington once believed it would remain nothing more than a compliant cog in the system designed by America. But history rarely sits still, waiting for people to catch up. And while America was busy repairing the cracks in its own house, China had already begun preparing for a role of much greater consequence. It is a fascinating irony that China's rise wasn't born from America's decline, at least not in the beginning. People often view history like a seesaw. One side must fall for the other to rise. But the real world is far more complex. Throughout the 90s and early 2000s, Beijing grew powerful within the very system Washington had designed. Their goods flooded every shipping lane. Their corporations penetrated Western markets. If the US was the master architect of the global order, China was simply the primary beneficiary of the blueprints. The turning point arrived in 2001, with China's entry into the WTO. Washington assumed this was a purely economic decision. They believed a wealthy, integrated nation would naturally evolve into a Western-style partner. For years, the assumption held true. Cities expanded, factories roared to life, and hundreds of millions were lifted out of poverty at breakneck speed. Investors of that era joked, if you missed China's growth in the 2000s, you weren't looking at the map. But hidden beneath the explosive GDP numbers was a deeper shift. Beijing wasn't just hoarding wealth, they were quietly mastering core capabilities. For decades, developing nations remained trapped at the bottom of the value chain. China started in that same trap, but they refused to stay there. Step by step, they climbed the ladder. From shoes to electronics, from simple assembly to high-end manufacturing. Then came the breakthrough from manufacturing to technological mastery. This wasn't a lucky leap, it was a generational climb. America was too busy teaching China to be a contract worker, forgetting that the apprentice was quietly transcribing the formulas, to open their own shop. So while the world remained fixated on what China was exporting, Beijing was silently calculating what they needed to dominate next. Power in the 21st century no longer belongs to those who produce the most. It lies in the hands of those who control the vital junctions of the global economy, from deep-sea ports and strategic minerals to supply chains, data, and core technology. In 2013, the Belt and Road Initiative was launched. The masses saw it as a massive infrastructure project. In reality, it was an effort to weave a new web of influence. Railways, ports, and highways began to stretch across the globe, connecting Asia to Africa and looming large over Europe. While not every nation agreed, the world had to face a blunt reality. China no longer wanted to play by the old rules. They were writing a new game. This does not mean China has dethroned America. The gap between the two superpowers remains vast in many critical sectors. That is why the question, Will China surpass the US? Misses the point entirely. This isn't a story of replacement. It is a story of options. If the world once relied on a single center, today there is a new name on the table. In economics, this is competition. In geopolitics, it is a repositioning of the scales of power. And this is the moment Brzezinski's greatest fear takes shape. It is not a direct military alliance against the US. It is not a Cold War ideological standoff. It is a world saturated with choices. Nations have begun to refuse to bet their entire future on a single player. India pursues its own interests, Saudi Arabia actively expands its diplomatic web, and ASEAN masterfully maintains the balance. As China pushes to expand its influence, a new question emerges. As the unipolar world dissolves, are we entering a new era of multipolarity, or are we sailing into uncharted waters? Because the greatest changes of this century will not be decided by Washington or Beijing alone. They depend on how the rest of the world reacts. Perhaps the greatest mistake in observing the modern world is trapping our thinking in the familiar script of power transferring from America to China. History has locked us onto that path. Rome crushed Carthage, Britain replaced the aging empires of Europe, and the US ascended after World War II. Whenever a dynasty falls, the masses wait to see who will ascend the throne next. But what if those rules have expired? What if the world, this time, isn't looking for a new master, but is quietly learning how to exist in an era without a king? Signs of a leaderless order are emerging everywhere. India casually buys Russian oil while tightening security ties with the US. Saudi Arabia maintains Washington's defense umbrella while welcoming capital from Beijing. Southeast Asian nations accept Chinese infrastructure without letting go of Western military alliances. Their common thread is a refusal to pick sides. What they are desperate to keep is the right to choose. The Cold War forced nations to choose one of two poles for sanctuary. Today, the game is far more pragmatic. Trade with one, partner on technology with another, and buy energy from a third. Through a geopolitical lens, this is not betrayal. It is simply the art of diversifying risk. This survival logic is not new. If you are a business owner, you do not put all your revenue into one client. If you are an investor, you do not put all your eggs in one basket. So for a nation, why should they surrender their destiny to a single power center? This pragmatic thinking is taking root globally. It is not anti-American, nor is it necessarily pro-China. It is simply a quiet divorce from dependency. Yet a truly multipolar world is far harsher than the optimistic theories suggest. Multiple centers mean more choices, but they also mean endless competition. When one financial system dominates, the rules, even if unjust, are at least clear. When multiple payment systems coexist, the flow of money becomes chaotic. An overwhelming superpower creates imperfect order, but it provides structure. When too many giants crowd into a small room, the world becomes more flexible and more vulnerable than ever before. Therefore, strategists prefer to call this transitional waters rather than a stable multipolar world, because no one yet knows what the final board will look like. China is extending its reach, India is accelerating spectacularly, and regional powers are becoming more confident in their own sovereignty. But conversely, America still holds fortresses that no one has yet broken. The dollar remains the lifeblood of global finance. Top universities still attract the world's brightest minds, and Silicon Valley giants still program the digital economy. The paradox of the age is this: America no longer holds absolute power. Yet the world has not found a replacement. So when someone asks, who will replace the US? They are inadvertently using outdated thinking to solve a new problem. History does not always end by toppling one king to welcome another. Sometimes, it flips the entire board. The story of the 21st century will not be marked by the fall of Washington, nor the dominance of Beijing. It will be remembered as the quiet funeral of a strange chapter in human history, the era where the entire planet revolved around a single core. Romans believed Rome was eternal. The British boasted the sun would never set. And the generation after 1991 once thought the American moment would last forever. They were not entirely wrong. The US shaped the modern world in a way few empires ever did. But time has a ruthless nature. It refuses to stand still. Now, as new centers of power rise and different rules are tested, the cracks are no longer predictions. They are visible, right before our eyes. But there is one truth more frightening than the fall of an empire. It is when the lights go out and the whole world realizes they are stepping into a new chapter of history without a guide. The old board is broken, but the new one has yet to be drawn.